Picture this. You're walking through the streets of ancient Bubastis around 900 BCE, and everywhere you look, there are cats. Not just a few strays, but thousands of them, treated like royalty, fed the finest fish, adorned with golden earrings and jeweled collars. Kill one of these cats, even accidentally, and you might face execution. This isn't some bizarre fever dream. This was reality in ancient Egypt, and at the center of this feline obsession stood one deity who transformed from a terrifying lioness into the purring protector of households, the enigmatic Bastet. But here's what nobody tells you about this cat goddess. Her story is so much stranger and more complex than the cute cat memes would have you believe. The ancient Egyptians didn't just worship cats because they were adorable. They saw something in these creatures that connected them to the very fabric of existence itself, something that made a cat goddess one of the most powerful and feared deities in their pantheon. And the transformation Bastet underwent over thousands of years reveals something profound about how civilizations evolve, how they cope with chaos, and why we still find ourselves drawn to these mysterious animals today. So let's dig into the real story, because what you think you know about Bastet is probably just the surface. The name itself is a puzzle that scholars still debate. Was it originally Bst, pronounced Bast or Bastet, or even Ubast as the Greeks called her? The hieroglyphs don't include vowels, which means we're essentially guessing at how ancient Egyptians actually said her name. But here's where it gets interesting. The name likely comes from the word for ointment jar, bas, with the feminine ending t. Why would a goddess be named after a jar? Because in ancient Egypt, ointment jars weren't just cosmetic containers, they were vessels of protection, preservation, and sweet scents that warded off decay and death. Already we're seeing that Bastet isn't just about cute cats. She's about protection against decay, against chaos, against the things that threaten life itself. Now, let's rewind to where Bastet actually came from, because her origin story is nothing like the gentle cat lady the Greeks later portrayed. In the earliest periods of Egyptian history, during the Second Dynasty around 2890 BCE, Bastet wasn't a cat at all. She was a lioness, fierce and terrifying, practically indistinguishable from the goddess Sekhmet. Think about that for a second. The goddess we now associate with domestic cats was originally one of the most fearsome predators in the African landscape. She was a solar deity, a warrior goddess, the Eye of Ra sent to punish humanity when they rebelled against the sun god. Ancient texts describe her as a force of pure destruction, breathing fire, causing plagues, slaughtering thousands. This wasn't a goddess you wanted to anger. This was divine wrath incarnate. But something changed. Over the centuries, particularly during the Middle Kingdom around 2000 BCE, Bastet began to transform. The lioness started to soften, her features became more domestic, more cat-like. By the late period, around 700 BCE, the transformation was complete. Bastet had become the cat goddess we recognize today. Why did this happen? This isn't just about changing artistic styles or random cultural drift. This shift reveals something fundamental about how the ancient Egyptians were reimagining their relationship with the divine. The Egypt of the Old Kingdom was a society obsessed with order imposed through force, with pharaohs who saw themselves as living gods maintaining cosmic balance through sheer power. But as Egyptian society matured, as it went through periods of chaos and reunification, as it interacted with other cultures and faced existential threats, the Egyptian worldview evolved. They began to understand that order doesn't just come from force, it comes from protection, from nurturing, from the kind of fierce yet gentle guardianship that a mother cat shows her kittens. And this is where the domestic cat enters the story in a big way. See, cats weren't native to Egyptian households initially. The African wildcat, Felis sylvestris libica, was the ancestor of domestic cats, and these animals started hanging around Egyptian grain stores around 4000 BCE, because where there's grain, there are mice and rats. The Egyptians weren't stupid. They immediately recognized the value of these small predators. Cats protected the grain stores that fed the civilization. They killed venomous snakes. They kept disease-carrying rodents at bay. In a very real sense, cats were protecting the foundation of Egyptian prosperity and survival. But the Egyptians saw something more in these creatures. Watch a cat, and you'll notice something uncanny. They're both predator and companion. Fierce and affectionate, independent yet loyal. Creatures of the night who also bask in the sun. They embody contradictions. They bridge worlds. To the Egyptian mind, which was deeply invested in concepts of duality and balance, the cat was a perfect symbol of how opposing forces could coexist. And Bastet became the divine embodiment of this principle. Here's where most accounts get Bastet wrong. They treat her as if she was just the goddess of cats, like she was some ancient Egypt's patron saint of pet owners. That's not even close to the full picture. Bastet was the goddess of home and hearth, of fertility and childbirth, of perfume and cosmetics, of joy and celebration, of music and dance, of protection against evil spirits and disease, of the defensive aspects of the king's power. She was one of the most multifaceted deities in the Egyptian pantheon. Her roles overlapped with dozens of other goddesses, which is why she was often syncretized, merged with deities like Mut, Hathor, and Isis. Think about what all these domains have in common. They're all about protection and nurturing within the domestic sphere, about the kind of power that doesn't conquer through force but maintains through vigilance. A mother protecting her children, that's Bastet. A perfume that wards off evil spirits through its scent, that's Bastet. A household cat that kills a venomous snake before it reaches a sleeping child, that's Bastet in action. The ancient Egyptians understood something we've largely forgotten, that protection and nurturing require just as much strength as warfare and conquest, maybe more. And they embodied this understanding in a goddess who could be both the gentle cat purring in your lap and the fierce lioness ready to tear apart anything that threatened her charges. Now, let's talk about Bubastis, because this is where the Bastet cult reached its absolute peak, and what happened there was both magnificent and slightly insane. Bubastis, located in the Nile Delta in Lower Egypt, was Bastet's cult center, her holy city, the place where her main temple stood. The Greek historian Herodotus visited this temple in the 5th century BCE, and his description is one of the most valuable sources we have about Bastet worship. According to Herodotus, the Temple of Bastet was the most pleasing to look at of all the temples in Egypt. It was built on an island, surrounded by water on all sides except for the entrance, with 2 canals flowing from the Nile around it, but not mixing. The temple itself stood in the center of the city, visible from all directions because the city had been built up around it over time, so the temple remained at the original ground level while everything else rose higher. It was surrounded by trees, and inside stood a massive statue of Bastet. But here's the kicker. Herodotus also describes something that sounds almost impossible to believe. He claims that the annual festival of Bastet was the largest religious gathering in Egypt, attracting over 700,000 pilgrims. Now, scholars debate whether Herodotus was exaggerating. Ancient historians weren't always precise with numbers, but even if we assume he inflated the figure, we're still talking about an absolutely massive festival that dwarfed most other religious celebrations in the ancient world. And what happened at this festival is where things get really interesting. This wasn't your typical solemn religious ceremony with priests chanting and people praying quietly. The festival of Bastet was, according to Herodotus, a massive party, a celebration of joy, music, and drinking. People would travel to Bubastis by boat, and during the journey they would play music, clap, dance, and the women would shout challenges to women in the towns they passed. Once they arrived at Bubastis, they would make sacrifices, but then the real celebration would begin. There was more wine consumed at this festival than during the entire rest of the year combined, or so Herodotus claims. There was singing, dancing, revelry of all kinds. This was a festival of joy, of life, of the pleasures that make existence worthwhile. Now, think about this for a moment. Why would a goddess primarily associated with protection and the home be celebrated with what basically sounds like the ancient world's biggest party? This is where we need to understand the Egyptian concept of joy and celebration as forms of cosmic order. The Egyptians didn't see pleasure and responsibility as opposites. They saw joy as a necessary component of maintaining May-at, the cosmic balance. A society that's all work and no play, all duty and no pleasure, is a society out of balance, vulnerable to chaos. Bastet's festival wasn't frivolous, it was essential. It was a release valve, a way to renew the community's energy, to celebrate life in the face of death, to reaffirm the bonds of pleasure and joy that make life worth protecting. And here's something that'll blow your mind. Archaeological evidence supports the scale of this cat worship in ways that are both fascinating and slightly disturbing. In the late 19th century, an Egyptian farmer stumbled upon something extraordinary near the ancient site of Bubastis, a massive cemetery containing literally hundreds of thousands of mummified cats. We're not talking about a few dozen fancy cat mummies, we're talking about an industrial-scale operation. Cats were bred, raised, mummified, and buried as offerings to Bastet in numbers that are hard to comprehend. Some estimates put the total number of cat mummies found at various Bastet cult sites at over 4 million. 4 million mummified cats. Let that sink in for a moment. This wasn't casual worship, this was an entire economy built around the veneration of Bastet. There were cat breeders, cat mummifiers, people who sold cat mummies to pilgrims, priests who performed the burial rituals. The cat mummy industry was big business. Pilgrims would come to Bubastis or other cult centers, purchase a mummified cat, and offer it to Bastet as a way of gaining her favor. Some of these mummies were elaborately decorated, wrapped in intricate patterns, with painted faces and bronze statues of cats accompanying them. Others were simple utilitarian bundles. And here's where it gets darker. Modern CT scans and X-rays of these cat mummies have revealed something troubling. Many of these mummified cats were kittens, sometimes just weeks old. Some mummies didn't even contain complete cats, just a few bones or even completely different animals passed off as cats. The demand for cat mummies apparently outstripped the supply, leading to fraud and some pretty grim practices. This raises uncomfortable questions about the cat cult. Were these cats bred specifically to be killed and mummified? The evidence suggests yes. Was this really honoring Bastet? Or had the worship devolved into a commercial enterprise that exploited the very animals it was supposed to revere? It's a reminder that even the most well-intentioned religious practices can become corrupted when they scale up and money gets involved. But let's not judge the ancient Egyptians too harshly. Every culture has its contradictions. And the cat mummy industry, as problematic as it was, still reveals something important about how seriously the Egyptians took their relationship with Bastet. They believed that offering a mummified cat could heal the sick, grant fertility, protect travelers, ward off evil. These weren't trivial concerns, these were matters of life and death. And if breeding cats for mummification seems cruel to us, remember that the Egyptians genuinely believed they were elevating these cats to a higher purpose, transforming them into eternal offerings to the goddess. Now let's talk about how Bastet was actually depicted in art and iconography, because this tells us a lot about how the Egyptians understood her nature. In her earliest forms, as we mentioned, Bastet was shown as a woman with a lioness head, often carrying a sistrum, a musical instrument associated with joy and celebration, and an aegis, a ceremonial shield decorated with a lion's head. But as she transformed into the cat goddess, her depictions changed dramatically. By the late period, Bastet was most commonly shown as a woman with a cat's head, or simply as a seated cat, often wearing gold jewelry, especially earrings. Sometimes she's shown with kittens at her feet, emphasizing her role as a protective mother figure. The sistrum remained her constant attribute, connecting her to music, dance, and celebration. But here's a detail most people miss. Bastet is almost always depicted holding or near a basket. Remember how her name might come from the word for ointment jar? Well, in many representations, she's associated with containers, with vessels that hold precious things. This isn't random symbolism, it's deeply meaningful. Bastet as a container goddess is Bastet as protector of what's precious and vulnerable. She's the vessel that holds and protects life itself, just as a mother's womb holds and protects a child, just as a home holds and protects a family. The color associations with Bastet are equally revealing. She's often depicted in green or blue-green, colors associated with fertility, vegetation, and the life-giving Nile. But she's also associated with red, the color of blood, of life force, of the dangerous power that must be controlled. This dual color symbolism captures the essential paradox of Bastet. She's both nurturing and dangerous, both gentle and fierce, both the protector of life and the destroyer of threats to life. You can't have one without the other. A mother is love, isn't truly protective unless it comes with the willingness to destroy anything that threatens her children. Now here's where things get really complex, the relationship between Bastet and Sekhmet. Remember how we said Bastet started out as a lioness goddess almost identical to Sekhmet? Well, even after Bastet transformed into a cat goddess, the two deities remained intimately connected. In fact, many scholars argue they're really two aspects of the same goddess, two faces of the same divine force. Sekhmet is the eye of Ra in its destructive aspect, the burning rage of the sun that punishes and destroys. Bastet is the eye of Ra in its protective aspect, the watchful guardian that wards off threats before they can cause harm. Think of it this way: Sekhmet is what happens when divine wrath is unleashed, when the social order breaks down and violence becomes necessary. Bastet is what maintains order so that Sekhmet never needs to be unleashed. They're complementary forces, two sides of the same coin, and the Egyptians understood this connection deeply. There's a famous myth called the destruction of mankind that illustrates this perfectly. In this story, Ra, the sun god, grows angry with humanity for plotting against him. He sends out his eye, his daughter, to punish them. The eye takes the form of Hathor, who then transforms into Sekhmet and begins slaughtering humans by the thousands. She becomes drunk on blood, intoxicated by violence, and won't stop killing. Ra realizes he's made a mistake. Humanity will be completely destroyed if Sekhmet continues, so he devises a plan. He orders his followers to brew 7,000 jars of beer and mix it with red ochre to make it look like blood. They pour this blood-colored beer onto the fields, and when Sekhmet comes across it, she thinks it's human blood and drinks it eagerly. The beer makes her drunk, and she falls asleep. When she wakes up, she's transformed into Bastet, the gentle cat goddess, her rage soothed, her bloodlust satisfied. This myth is absolutely crucial for understanding Bastet. She's not separate from the violent, destructive aspect of the divine feminine. She's what that violence becomes when it's soothed, controlled, transformed into something protective rather than destructive. The beer in the myth, by the way, isn't just a random detail, it's connected to the beer and wine consumed at Bastet's festivals. Through joy, through celebration, through the bonds of community and pleasure, the destructive force is transformed into a protective one. This is sophisticated psychological and social insight wrapped in mythological language. Now, let's talk about Bastet's family connections, because in Egyptian mythology, who you're related to matters enormously. Bastet was considered the daughter of Ra, the sun god, which immediately places her in the highest tier of divine beings. But her relationships get complicated depending on which tradition you're following. In some versions, she's the wife of Ptah, the creator god, and the mother of Mahis, a lion-headed god of war. In other traditions, she's associated with Atum, another creator deity. She's sometimes equated or syncretized with Mut, the mother goddess, and with Hathor, the goddess of love and joy. This fluidity of relationships and identities might seem confusing to us, but it reflects how the Egyptians thought about their gods. Deities weren't fixed, rigid personalities like characters in a novel. They were forces, principles, aspects of reality that could merge, separate, and recombine depending on context. Bastet could be a daughter, a wife, a mother, a virgin warrior, all at once or at different times, because she represented principles that manifested differently in different situations. Her son, Mas, is particularly interesting. He's a lion-headed god associated with war, weather, and knives. He protects the innocent and executes the guilty. Sound familiar? He's essentially the masculine version of what Bastet represents, fierce protection that doesn't hesitate to use violence when necessary. The apple doesn't fall far from the tree, or in this case, the lion cub doesn't stray far from the cat. Now let's address something that confuses a lot of people: the relationship between Bastet and household cats in everyday Egyptian life. Yes, the Egyptians revered cats, and yes, they associated them with Bastet. But the reality was more nuanced than the popular image suggests. Not every cat was considered sacred in the sense of being a living incarnation of Bastet. Cats were valued, protected by law, and yes, harming one could result in severe punishment. But they were also working animals who earned their keep by protecting grain stores and homes from rodents and snakes. The mummification of pet cats shows that individual animals could be beloved companions, mourned when they died. Herodotus claimed that when a house cat died, the occupants would shave their eyebrows in mourning. Whether this was universal practice or Herodotus exaggerating again, it indicates that cats held a special place in Egyptian households. But here's the thing: this reverence for cats wasn't just superstition or arbitrary religious law, it was deeply practical. In a civilization that depended entirely on stored grain, that faced constant threats from venomous snakes and disease-carrying rodents, cats were literally lifesavers. The religious reverence for cats and for Bastet grew out of this practical reality. The Egyptians elevated the cat to divine status because they recognized, correctly, that these animals were essential to their survival and prosperity. This brings us to one of the most fascinating aspects of Bastet worship: the connection between cats, women, and domestic power. Bastet wasn't just a goddess of the home in some abstract sense. She was intimately connected to women's lives, women's work, and women's power within Egyptian society. Think about the domains Bastet governed: childbirth, fertility, protection of children, perfumes and cosmetics, the home. These were all areas where women held significant authority and expertise. In a society where public political power was predominantly male, Bastet represented a form of power that was feminine, domestic, but no less essential or real. The perfume connection is particularly revealing. In ancient Egypt, perfumes and scented oils weren't just luxury items or cosmetic enhancements, they were powerful tools with religious, medical, and social significance. Perfumes were used in temple rituals, in mummification, in medicine, and in daily life to ward off evil spirits and disease. The production of perfumes was often women's work, specialized knowledge passed down through generations. Bastet, as the goddess of perfume, was Bastet, as the patron of this specialized female knowledge and power. And here's something that'll change how you think about ancient Egyptian gender dynamics: the title of Bastet's high priestesses. They were called the chief of the harem of Bastet, which sounds to modern ears like they were running some kind of improper establishment. But harem in this context doesn't mean what we think it means. It refers to the sacred precinct of the goddess, the inner sanctum of the temple where the goddess dwelt. The chief of the harem was essentially the head priestess, the highest religious authority in Bastet's cult, and this was a position of enormous power and prestige. These weren't women confined to domestic obscurity, these were women who wielded significant religious and political influence. Now, let's talk about something that doesn't get nearly enough attention: Bastet's role in Egyptian magic and protective practices. The ancient Egyptians were deeply concerned with magic, with Heka, the force that made things happen, that could be harnessed for protection or harm. And Bastet was one of the most important deities invoked in protective magic. She appears constantly in magical texts and amulets designed to protect against demons, evil spirits, disease, and misfortune. Why? Because Bastet was understood as a boundary keeper, a goddess who patrolled the liminal spaces between the known and unknown, between the safe domestic sphere and the dangerous outside world, between life and death. Cats themselves were seen as magical creatures because of their ability to see in the dark, to move silently, to sense things humans couldn't detect. Anyone who's lived with a cat knows that eerie experience of watching your cat stare intently at an empty corner of the room, clearly perceiving something you can't see. The Egyptians interpreted this as the cat's ability to see spirits and demons, to detect threats from the invisible realm. Bastet amulets were worn by women during pregnancy and childbirth, by travelers venturing into dangerous territories, by anyone who felt threatened by unseen forces. These weren't just pretty jewelry. These were magical tools believed to channel Bastet's protective power directly to the wearer. And the evidence suggests that belief in their efficacy was widespread across all social classes. But here's where Bastet's story takes a darker turn, and this is something that often gets glossed over in popular accounts. As Egypt's power waned, as it faced invasion and conquest, as foreign powers took control, the worship of Bastet changed and eventually declined. The Persian conquest of Egypt in 525 BCE marked the beginning of the end for the great cat cults. The Persians didn't understand or respect Egyptian religious practices. According to some accounts, the Persian king Cambyses deliberately had cats killed and their bodies thrown over the walls of Egyptian cities as a psychological warfare tactic, knowing how sacred cats were to the Egyptians. Whether this story is true or exaggerated, it represents the vulnerability of Bastet worship to outside contempt and attack. Later, under Greek and Roman rule, Bastet was syncretized with Greek goddesses like Artemis and Diana, losing much of her specifically Egyptian character. The Romans were particularly harsh. They saw the Egyptian worship of animal-headed gods as primitive superstition. The cat cults gradually died out, the temples fell into ruin, the festivals ceased. By the time Christianity became dominant in Egypt in the 4th century CE, Bastet worship was already a shadow of what it had been. The great temple at Bubastis was eventually destroyed, its stones carted away for other building projects. Today, almost nothing remains of it. You can visit the site and see only rubble and a few scattered blocks, barely enough to suggest the magnificent structure that once stood there. And those millions of cat mummies we talked about earlier? Here's the most depressing part of the story. In the 1880s, a British ship loaded up tons of cat mummies from Egypt and transported them to England. But these weren't destined for museums or scholarly study. They were ground up and sold as fertilizer. Literally, tons of cat mummies, each one representing an offering to Bastet, each one part of a religious tradition that had lasted thousands of years, ended up being spread on English fields to help crops grow. It's hard to think of a more ignominious end to a religious tradition. But before we get too melancholy about Bastet's decline, let's consider something interesting. Has Bastet worship really ended? Think about how we relate to cats today in modern Western culture. We don't build temples to cat goddesses anymore, but we do create millions of cat photos and videos. We pamper our cats with specialized food and toys and medical care. We ascribe to them an almost mystical significance in our lives. The Internet, that vast repository of human culture and obsession, is absolutely saturated with cat content. Why? What is it about cats that continues to captivate us thousands of years after Bastet's temples fell? Maybe the ancient Egyptians were onto something that we're still responding to on some deep, unconscious level. Cats represent a kind of power that's different from what we usually associate with strength and dominance. They're small but fierce, gentle but dangerous, affectionate but independent. They live with us but remain fundamentally wild. They bridge the gap between the domestic and the untamed in ways that few other animals do. Now let's dig into some of the specific myths and stories about Bastet, because these reveal layers of meaning that the iconography alone can't convey. One of the most important myths involves Bastet's journey to Nubia. In this story, Bastet becomes angry and leaves Egypt, traveling south into Nubia, the lands beyond Egypt's traditional borders. While she's gone, Egypt suffers terribly. Without Bastet's protection, evil spirits and demons run rampant, disease spreads, homes are no longer safe. The gods realize they need to bring Bastet back, so they send Thoth, the god of wisdom, to persuade her to return. Thoth finds Bastet in her most primal form, as a wild lioness, and he must use all his cleverness to convince her to return to Egypt and resume her role as protector. He tells her stories, uses flattery, appeals to her sense of duty, and gradually, over the course of the journey back, Bastet transforms from the wild lioness back into the gentle cat goddess. By the time they reach Egypt, she's ready to resume her protective role. This myth encodes several important ideas. First, it acknowledges that protective power can't be taken for granted. It must be honored and maintained, or it will withdraw. Second, it shows that Bastet's transformation from lioness to cat isn't permanent or automatic. It's something that must be continually renewed through proper respect and ritual. Third, it emphasizes the role of wisdom and persuasion in maintaining social order. You can't force protection. You have to coax it, nurture it, earn it. Another crucial story involves Bastet's role in protecting Ra during his nightly journey through the underworld. Every night, Ra the sun god travels through the Duat, the realm of the dead, sailing in his solar bark from west to east to be reborn at dawn. This journey is fraught with danger. The most significant threat is Apophis, the great serpent of chaos who tries to swallow Ra and prevent the sun from rising. Various gods accompany Ra on this journey to protect him, and Bastet is one of the most important defenders. In some versions of the myth, Bastet takes the form of a great cat who uses a knife to behead Apophis each night. There are even illustrations in ancient texts showing a cat with a knife standing over a serpent, cutting off its head. This is Bastet in her most primal protective role, the guardian who battles chaos itself to ensure that order continues, that the sun rises, that life persists. Think about the symbolism here. The sun's journey through darkness and its rebirth at dawn was, for the Egyptians, the fundamental pattern of existence. Everything that lived followed this pattern: death and rebirth, chaos and order, darkness and light. And Bastet, the cat goddess, was one of the key protectors ensuring this cycle continued. Without her, the sun might not rise, chaos might triumph, existence itself might end. That's not a minor deity. That's a goddess whose role is absolutely essential to the continuation of reality. Now, here's something fascinating that connects to both mythology and actual Egyptian practice: the relationship between Bastet and eye health. Bastet was frequently invoked in spells and remedies for eye diseases, which were extremely common in ancient Egypt due to the sandy, dusty environment and the intense sunlight. But the connection goes deeper than just practical medicine. In Egyptian thought, the eye was deeply symbolic. The eye of Ra, the eye of Horus, these weren't just body parts, they were cosmic principles, aspects of divine power. Bastet, as an aspect of the eye of Ra, was naturally associated with protecting human eyes as well. And here's where it gets interesting. Cats' eyes were seen as magical in themselves, reflecting light in the dark, able to see what humans couldn't. The way a cat's pupils dilate and contract was associated with the waxing and waning of the moon, another cosmic cycle. So invoking Bastet for eye health wasn't just asking for medical intervention, it was asking to participate in the divine vision, to see truly, to have one's sight protected by the same power that allowed Ra to see through darkness. Let's talk about Bastet's relationship with other popular Egyptian deities, because these connections reveal how integrated she was into the broader Egyptian religious system. Her connection to Hathor is particularly significant. Hathor, the cow-headed goddess of love, beauty, music, and joy, shares many attributes with Bastet. Both carry the sistrum, both are associated with celebration and music, both are considered daughters of Ra, both have fierce protective aspects. In fact, in some periods and regions, Bastet and Hathor were so closely identified that they were essentially interchangeable. The main difference seems to be that Hathor's associations were more celestial and cosmic, while Bastet's were more terrestrial and domestic, but the boundary between them was porous. Then there's Bastet's relationship with Isis, the great mother goddess, arguably the most important goddess in the entire Egyptian pantheon. Isis was associated with magic, healing, protection, motherhood, and the throne itself. Bastet's protective maternal aspects naturally aligned with Isis, and in later periods, the two goddesses were often syncretized. Amulets sometimes show features of both goddesses combined. What this tells us is that Bastet wasn't some isolated cat cult existing on the margins of Egyptian religion. She was deeply integrated into the core mythological and theological structures. Her worship connected to and reinforced the worship of other major deities. Now, let's address something that modern esoteric and pagan practitioners often get wrong about Bastet. In contemporary spirituality, Bastet is frequently invoked as a goddess of independence, of fierce femininity, of doing whatever you want without regard for social constraints. She's portrayed as a kind of divine rebel, a goddess who encourages breaking rules and following your passions wherever they lead. But this is pretty much the opposite of what Bastet actually represented in ancient Egypt. Bastet wasn't about breaking social order, she was about maintaining it. She wasn't about rebellion, she was about protection. She wasn't about wild independence, she was about the fierce loyalty that protects the vulnerable. Yes, she had a wild, lioness aspect, but that wildness was always in service of order, not chaos. The Egyptians had plenty of chaos deities, Apophis and Set most notably, but Bastet was definitively on the side of order, Ma'at, cosmic balance. This doesn't make her boring or domesticated in some diminished sense. It makes her powerful in a specific way. She represents the truth that real strength often lies in protection rather than destruction, in maintenance rather than disruption, in the fierce commitment to defending what matters rather than the flashy gesture of tearing things down. So, what can we take away from the story of Bastet? What does this ancient Egyptian cat goddess have to teach us today, thousands of years after her temples crumbled and her festivals ended? First, Bastet's transformation from lioness to cat teaches us something profound about how cultures evolve their understanding of power. The early Egyptians, building their civilization through conquest and force, needed gods of pure destructive power. But as their society matured, as they learned that maintaining a civilization is harder than building one, they needed a different kind of divine power, protective rather than destructive, nurturing rather than dominating. Bastet's evolution mirrors the evolution of Egyptian society itself, from a culture of warriors to a culture of administrators, merchants, families trying to live peaceful lives. This is a pattern we can see in many cultures, the shift from valorizing pure martial strength to valorizing the strength that protects and nurtures. Second, Bastet reminds us that the domestic sphere isn't trivial or diminished, it's fundamental. In our modern world, we often dismiss domestic concerns as less important than public, political, or economic matters. We talk about work-life balance as if work is the real thing and life is just what happens in the margins. But the Egyptians understood that the home, the family, the daily practices of protection and nurturing, these are the foundation of everything else. Without safe homes, without protected children, without the daily maintenance of life, There is no civilization. There's nothing. Bastet, as a major deity, as important as gods of war or kingship, reflects this understanding. She wasn't a minor goddess for minor concerns. She was essential because what she protected was essential. Third, the relationship between Bastet and actual cats teaches us about how the sacred and the practical can intertwine. The Egyptians didn't revere cats despite their practical utility. They revered them because of it. They recognized that these animals, by protecting grain stores and killing venomous snakes, were doing sacred work. They elevated the practical to the sacred rather than separating them. In our modern world, we tend to create rigid boundaries between the sacred and the mundane, between the spiritual and the practical. Bastet's cult suggests a different approach. What if the most sacred things are precisely the most practical, the most essential to daily survival and flourishing? What if protecting your home from vermin is as sacred as any temple ritual? Fourth, Bastet's dual nature, fierce and gentle, protective and nurturing, reminds us that these qualities aren't opposites but complements. Real protection requires the capacity for violence held in check by wisdom and compassion. Real gentleness requires the strength to defend what you care about. The modern world often tries to separate these qualities, to say you're either tough or kind, either a warrior or a nurturer. But Bastet says no, true strength is both. True protection requires both the claws and the purr. Now let's talk about Bastet's legacy and how she appears in modern culture, because the cat goddess hasn't entirely disappeared. She shows up in fantasy literature, in video games, in modern pagan practices, in art and popular culture. But most of these appearances are pretty superficial. Bastet as a cool Egyptian aesthetic, as a cat lady deity, as a symbol without substance. What's often missing is any real engagement with what Bastet actually meant, with the sophisticated theological and philosophical ideas she embodied. There are exceptions, of course. Some modern practitioners of Kemetic Reconstructionism, people who attempt to revive ancient Egyptian religious practices, do serious research into Bastet worship, and try to engage with her in ways that honor the historical reality. Some artists and writers use Bastet as a starting point for exploring themes of protection, domesticity, and the power of the feminine. But for the most part, Bastet in modern culture is more like a Halloween costume than a living religious concept, and maybe that's inevitable. We're not ancient Egyptians. We don't live in a world where cats are the primary defense against crop-destroying rodents, where venomous snakes are a daily household danger, where infant mortality is so high that protective deities feel urgently necessary. Our relationship to the sacred, to the domestic, to animals, to power itself, has all changed dramatically. We can study Bastet, we can appreciate her, we can even draw inspiration from her, but we can't worship her in the way ancient Egyptians did because we don't inhabit their world. But here's the thing. Maybe we need something like Bastet more than we realize. Think about our modern anxieties. We worry about protecting our homes, our families, our children. We worry about threats both visible and invisible, from crime to disease to environmental toxins to the dangers of the digital world. We struggle to balance the fierce protection of what we love with the gentleness that allows life to flourish. We're concerned about the domestic sphere, even as we're told to focus on career and public achievement. These are, fundamentally, Bastet's concerns. The specifics have changed, but the underlying human needs haven't. We still need protection, we still need the domestic sphere to be sacred, we still need to honor the daily work of maintaining life and defending what matters. So maybe Bastet's real legacy isn't in temples or festivals, or even in religious worship. Maybe it's in the ongoing human recognition that fierce protection of the vulnerable is sacred work, that the small and domestic can be more important than the large, and public, that the ability to be both gentle and dangerous is a kind of wisdom we desperately need. Every time someone fiercely protects their home and family, that's Bastet's energy. Every time someone finds strength in nurturing rather than dominating, That's Bastet's lesson. Every time someone recognizes that the small and seemingly powerless, like a house cat, can be essential and even sacred, that's Bastet's legacy continuing. The ancient Egyptians looked at cats and saw something divine, not because they were superstitious or primitive, but because they were paying attention. They noticed that these small animals embodied a kind of power that was different from brute strength, a power of vigilance, of quick response to threat, of fierce protection combined with gentle affection. They elevated this observation into mythology and theology, creating Bastet as a way to honor and invoke these qualities. We might not build temples to cat goddesses anymore, but every time we marvel at a cat's grace, every time we appreciate their ability to be both predator and companion, every time we recognize that protection and nurturing are forms of strength, we're touching something the ancient Egyptians understood deeply. Bastet's story, from fierce lioness to gentle cat, from destroyer to protector, from wild goddess to domestic guardian, is ultimately a story about how we learn to channel power wisely, how we learn that true strength often looks nothing like domination, how we learn that the sacred can be found in the everyday, in the home, in the small fierce creature purring in your lap but ready to defend you at a moment's notice. The temples are gone, the festivals have ended, the cat mummies were ground into fertilizer, but the essential insight remains. Protection is sacred. The domestic is essential. Fierceness and gentleness are not opposites, but partners. And sometimes the divine looks exactly like a cat sitting in a sunbeam, apparently sleeping, but actually watching, always watching, ready to defend what matters. That's Bastet's gift to us, not as ancient history, not as exotic mythology, but as a living understanding of what it means to be truly protective, truly strong, truly committed to defending life itself. And maybe, just maybe, that's why we still can't stop making cat videos, why we still pamper and revere these small predators in our homes, why the internet, our modern temple, is absolutely filled with images of cats. Perhaps, on some level, we're still responding to what the ancient Egyptians recognized thousands of years ago, that there's something sacred in these creatures, something that speaks to our deepest needs for protection, for the balance of strength and gentleness, for the fierce love that defends without destroying. Bastet's temples may be ruins, but her spirit, the understanding she embodied, lives on in every home where a cat stands guard in every heart, that knows protection is the highest form of love in every moment, when we choose to be both fierce and gentle, both strong and nurturing, both wild and domestic. The cat goddess of ancient Egypt speaks to something eternal in human experience, and as long as we need protection, as long as we value the domestic sphere, as long as we recognize that true power knows when to purr and when to show its claws, Bastet's story will continue to matter.